Let's calculate and interpret relative change. Now with relative change, I'm going to assume you've already watched and worked on absolute change because these kind of go together. Recall, just real quick, that absolute change is new minus the old. So you'll notice in the numerator of the relative change, that's what we have. So relative change is really just the absolute change divided by the old value or the reference value. Because when we're finding the relative change, which we ultimately turn into a percent change, we are always basing this on the reference. Where did we come from, right? Because reference means where we came from. Okay, let's look at some problems. The U.S. population was 298 million in 2006 and 323 million in 2016. Calculate and interpret the relative change. So remember, relative change is absolute change divided by the old value. So we know absolute change. Well, first let's recognize 2016 is the newest. So we're going to take 323 and subtract 298 to get the absolute change. And then the old value is the reference, which is 298. Now, if you write it out like this, you'll notice that whatever is on the right in the numerator should be in the denominator because that's where the old values lie. So I have 25 divided by 298, and this gives me a roughly 0.084. So this technically is the relative change, but that doesn't really tell us anything. So we often talk about relative change as a percent change. So if we change this to a percent, it's 84.4%. Similar to absolute change. If you don't know what this means, it is worthless. So we would say the U.S. population. So you always talk about, what are you talking about? The U.S. population, what happened to it? Well, this was a positive. So it increased 8.4% from 2006 to 2016. So interpreting absolute and relative change, they are very similar. The only difference is how you're describing it. Are you using static numbers, right? Just the subtraction, the difference, or are you changing that difference into a percent? Let's do some examples. Now, Juliette's weight went from 180 to 162 from May to December. Find and interpret the relative change. Well, first we had to find the absolute change. From May to December, so December is new, so 162 minus 180, we end up with an absolute change of negative 18, or she lost 18 pounds. So to find our relative change, we're going to take that negative 18 and divide by our old value of 180, and we get negative 0.1. So that is like a decrease of 10%. So the interpretation, Juliette's weight decreased 10% from May to December. That's what it means. Okay. The median income in the U.S. was $57,230 in 2015 and $67,520 in 2020. Find and interpret the relative change. Remember, relative change, absolute change over the old. Absolute change is new minus old. So we would take the new value, 67,520, minus the old value, 57,230, and divide by 57,230. If you write it out like this, great, high five, love this for you. Make sure you calculate the numerator first. So we have an absolute change of 10,290, then we divide by the denominator 57,230, which gives us a 0.1798. It's roughly 18%. Interpret. First, what are we talking about? The median income in the U.S. Great. What happened to it? It increased 18%. How do I know it increased? Well, one, I can see that it went up, but also when we found this, our values were positive. So it increased 18%, and then the last question is when? And that was from 2015 to 2020. So there's three parts to these sentences, right? Who or what are we talking about? And then the action, what happened, the increase or the decrease, and then when. Give me a time frame. You put those three together, and now you have an interpretation. You'll notice the words relative change are nowhere in the sentence. The relative change simply tells us what value we're finding, what is happening, how does this work together. That's what we're dealing with. All right, in our last question here, John is 6'2" and Miguel is 5'9". Compare Miguel to John by finding and interpreting the relative change with John as the reference. Okay, so first things first, I have 6'2" and 5'9". I have mixed measurements, so I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, 6 feet times 12 inches gives me 72, plus those extra 2. That means John is 74 inches tall. Okay, Miguel's 5'9", so 5 times 12 gives me the 60, plus those extra 9 inches, so Miguel is 69 inches tall. Much better. Now, John is the reference. So John is old, Miguel is new. Relative change is absolute change over the old, which means new minus old over old. So I'm going to take Miguel, 69 inches, minus John, 74 inches, all over the old, which is John, 74. So I get negative 5 over 74, which comes out to be negative 0.068. So as a percentage, that's like 6.8% shorter. Notice I didn't say a decrease because we didn't cut off John's legs to make him Miguel. That's not how this works. So our interpretation would be Miguel is 6.8% shorter than John. When you are talking, so we don't have time here. Now we're talking about just two people, so there's no time reference. You notice that it's Miguel, since we're comparing to John, as John as the reference. So whoever is old, that's what, no, let me back that up. I said whoever is new is what we're going to start with. So Miguel is new, Miguel is who we're starting with. That's the idea. Okay, letter B. Should we expect the same outcome if we were to use Miguel as the reference? With absolute change, the answer was yes, because there was the same difference. No matter how you subtract them, they're 5 inches apart. So the absolute change is the same, because there are 5 inches of difference. But remember what relative change is about. We divide by the reference. So if we change Miguel to be old, then we're comparing John to Miguel. So we're still going to take new minus old divided by old, but now that would be John minus Miguel over Miguel. So 74 minus 69 over 69. Notice that even though the numerator is still 5, the denominator changes. So the answer to part B is no, because when you're finding a relative change, you're changing the reference. And because we're changing the reference and the denominator, it's going to change our decimal, it's going to change our percentage. The relative change is different. So when I take 5 divided by 69, I get 0.0724, or roughly 7.2%. So that means John is 7.2% taller than Miguel. So think about how you're doing this. If you're comparing John to Miguel, then John here is our new value, and we're comparing that to Miguel, so Miguel is our reference. So the second piece there, this to that, whatever you're comparing to, that's the reference, because you're comparing it to that. Here's my reference. Am I taller, bigger, smarter, prettier? Those are all subjective, but if we're talking about me, the answer is yes. That's the idea. Okay, so whoever you're comparing to, that's your reference.